My father bled my dog to death on the picnic table while I watched from the bedroom window, and he made sure I saw every second. I was 12 years old. Duke was 3, a German shepherd I'd raised from a puppy, the only creature in that house who loved me without conditions, without tests, without the threat of what would happen if I failed. He'd slept on my bed every night, his head on my feet, his breathing the sound that kept my heart steady while my father raged through the house below. That night, I'd found my father in the garage. He was hitting my mother with his belt, not the buckle, the flat side, the way he'd learned in the Marines to inflict maximum pain without leaving marks that would show in a uniform inspection. She was on her knees, her hands over her head, making the small sounds she always made, the ones that meant she was still conscious but had stopped fighting. I didn't scream. I'd learned not to scream. Screaming made it worse. Screaming made him creative. I ran to my room. I opened the window. I whistled 2 short, 1 long, the signal Duke knew meant come now, urgent. He came. He always came. He burst through the dog door, through the kitchen, through the living room where my father had left my mother on the floor. He found us in the garage, found my father raising the belt for another strike, and he growled. The sound filled the space. Not a bark, a growl from deep in his chest, a vibration that made the tools on the wall rattle. My father turned. For a second, I saw fear in his eyes, real fear, the kind he'd never shown to me or my mother, the kind that only an animal could summon from whatever hollow place his heart had become. Then Duke lunged. He caught my father's forearm in his jaws, not crushing, not tearing, just holding. A warning, a boundary, stop, no further. My father didn't stop, he laughed. He laughed while blood ran down his arm, while Duke's teeth held him while my mother crawled backward into the corner. He looked at me and his smile was the worst thing I'd ever seen. Well, he said. The bitch has a guard dog. He shook Duke off. Kicked him in the ribs, hard enough to make Duke yelp and retreat. Then he walked to the kitchen, wrapped his arm in a dish towel, and called me into the living room. Sit, he said. I sat. Duke lay beside me trembling, his eyes on my father's every move. You put an animal before your family, my father said. His voice was calm, conversational. You called him to attack your own father. Do you understand what that makes you? I didn't answer. I knew better. It makes you a traitor, he said. And traitors need to learn consequences. He went to bed. He didn't lock Duke up. He didn't punish me further. He just smiled and went to sleep, and I knew in the way that children who grow up with violence always know that the worst was coming, that he was waiting, that he wanted me to sleep, to hope, to believe that the morning would be normal. I didn't sleep. I held Duke all night, my face in his fur, whispering that I was sorry, that I'd protect him, that we'd run away together. He licked my hand. He trusted me. He was a dog, and dogs trust even when they shouldn't, even when the human has failed them before, even when the morning proves that trust was misplaced. At 3 a.m., my father came into my room. He had a syringe in his hand, ketamine, from the veterinary kit he kept for emergencies. He didn't speak. He just grabbed Duke by the scruff, injected him before I could move, and dragged his limp body down the stairs. I screamed then. I screamed and ran after them, but my father locked the basement door. I ran to the window. I pressed my face to the glass. The backyard was dark, lit only by the kitchen light spilling through the screen door. My father had tied Duke to the picnic table, the heavy wooden one he'd built himself, the one with the carved initials of every dog he'd ever trained. Duke was unconscious but breathing, his chest rising and falling, his tongue lolling. My father stood beside him. He was wearing his dress uniform, the one with the medals, the ribbons, the bronze star he'd killed for in a village whose name I never learned. He'd put it on for this. He dressed up to kill my dog. He looked up at the window. He saw me. He smiled. Then he took out his hunting knife. I won't describe what happened next. Not in detail. I will say that he was slow, that he was methodical, that he made sure I saw every cut, every movement, every second of Duke's body going still, that he looked at me through the glass whenever I tried to close my eyes, and he waited until I opened them again. When he finished, he left Duke on the table. He walked back into the house. He came to my room, unlocked the door, and stood in the doorway with blood on his uniform and his hands. This is what happens, he said, when you put a dog above your family. Duke was a disobedient soldier. Disobedient soldiers die. He turned to leave, then stopped. In the morning, you'll bury him with your hands, no gloves. The ground's frozen, but you'll manage. The Cole women are strong, we're soldiers. He went to bed. I sat by the window until dawn, watching my dog's body steam in the cold March air, watching the blood freeze on the wood, watching the sky turn gray and indifferent. In the morning, he made me dig. The ground was iron. My fingers bled. Every time I cried, he hit the back of my head with the butt of his service pistol. "Soldiers don't cry," he said. "Coal women are soldiers." I stopped crying. I buried Duke in a hole too shallow, in ground too hard, with hands too small, and I made a promise. Not out loud. Not where he could hear. Just in the part of myself that he'd never reached, the part that Duke had guarded, the part that still knew how to love. "I will come back for you," I promised Duke's ghost. "I will come back, and I will bring the dogs he couldn't kill." Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're here, maybe you know what it means to have your love used as a weapon against you. Maybe you know the particular horror of watching someone destroy the only creature that ever protected you slowly, while they make you watch. Maybe you know what it's like to bury your heart in frozen ground and swear to dig it up again. If that's you, subscribe, not because I have comfort, because I have a whistle. And because the story I'm about to tell you ends with me standing in my father's kitchen, watching him piss himself on the floor, while the dog he sold to die sat beside me and waited for a command I never gave. Here's my story. I left at 17, not ran left. I enlisted in the army with a forged birth certificate and a recruiter who didn't look too closely at my bruises. I became a military working dog handler. I trained shepherds, Malinois, Labradors, dogs that detected explosives, tracked insurgents, saved lives in places where the ground was always trying to kill you. I was good at it, better than good. I understood dogs in a way I never understood people. Dogs were honest. Their fear was real, their love was real, their loyalty had to be earned every day. You couldn't hit a dog into obedience, not real obedience, not the kind that held under fire. You had to build trust. You had to become someone worth following into hell. I followed them into hell. 3 deployments. 2 dogs lost, not to enemy fire, but to the stress, the heat, the cumulative weight of sniffing death every day. I buried them both properly with honors, with hands that didn't bleed because the ground wasn't frozen and no one hit me for crying. I came home at 28 with a medical discharge, hearing damage from an IED, a knee that wouldn't bend, and a file full of commendations I didn't care about. My mother had died 6 months earlier. Natural causes, the death certificate said. My father had called to tell me 3 weeks after the funeral he hadn't thought to invite me. "She went peacefully," he said, "in her sleep. Best way for a soldier to go." I didn't go to the funeral, I didn't mourn, I just waited. Then he called again. 6 months after my discharge. He was 6 to 7 now, widowed, diagnosed with COPD from 60 years of smoking, living alone in the house where Duke died, where my mother died, where I'd buried everything that mattered. "I need help," he said. His voice was smaller than I remembered. The voice of an old man who'd outlived his cruelty and found himself alone with it. "The VA cut my benefits. The neighborhood's gone to hell. I need family, Willow, I need my daughter." I said yes. Not because I forgave him, not because I loved him, because I had a promise to keep. The house was smaller than I remembered. Darker, the smell of cigarettes and old beer and the particular mustiness of a place where no one has opened a window in years. My father had shrunk, not just physically, though he was gaunt, his uniform hanging loose, his medals tarnished on the shelf. He'd shrunk in presence, in threat, in the ability to make me afraid. But I was still afraid. I felt it the moment I crossed the threshold. The kitchen where he'd killed Duke. The backyard where I'd dug. The basement where he'd locked my mother, where she died, peacefully, he said, in her sleep. I smiled. I unpacked my bag. I made him soup. I listened to his stories, the same stories, war stories, stories of men he'd killed and men he'd saved, stories that had always ended with him being the hero, the survivor, the one who'd earned his place in the world through violence. "You always were strong," he said one night, after his 3rd beer. "A real coal. Your mother was weak, but you got my blood." "Yes," I said, "I did." I explored the house while he slept. His room, unchanged from my childhood, the same quilt, the same photos, the same pistol in the nightstand drawer. The basement, where the lock was new but the door was old, where the air was cold and smelled of mold and something else. Something chemical, and my mother's room. Untouched, dust-covered, a shrine to a woman who'd never been allowed to have a self. Her clothes in the closet, her jewelry in a box, and behind the false panel at the back, I found it by accident, my hand brushing a seam that didn't match a metal box. Inside were her diaries. 15 years of them. Small notebooks filled with her cramped handwriting, the writing of a woman who'd learned to be invisible even on paper. I read them all. In 2 nights, while my father snored upstairs, I read about the beatings, the belts, the locked doors. About the dogs, not just Duke but the 3 before him. A beagle named Scout, killed when I was 4. A mutt named Buddy killed when I was 6. A collie named Lady killed when I was 8. Each time my mother had tried to leave, each time a neighbor had called the police, each time I'd shown weakness, crying too long, sleeping too deep, flinching too visibly, my father had killed a dog. He'd buried them in the woods behind the house, marked the graves with brass plaques, his military commendations, stolen from his uniform, hammered into the dirt as grave markers. Trophies, warnings, proof that he could take what you loved and make it his. But the last diary was different. Dated 6 months before her death. My mother had found a puppy, a German shepherd, abandoned on the highway. She'd hidden him in the shed. She'd fed him, named him, planned to escape with him, with the diaries with proof of everything. My father found out. He didn't kill the puppy. He sold him to a man who knows how to train real obedience to an underground fighting ring. The puppy, she wrote, had howled when they took him. She'd heard it from the kitchen window, and then she'd heard nothing. 3 days later, my father locked her in the basement, took her insulin, waited 7 to 2 hours. Natural causes, the death certificate said. Diabetic coma. No one questioned it. My father was a veteran, a hero, a man who'd cared for his ailing wife. I sat in my mother's room holding her last diary, and I felt something I'd thought was gone. Not grief, I'd buried that with Duke. Not rage, I'd burned that in the desert, watching my dogs work, watching them trust me, watching them die for me. Purpose. Cold and clear as groundwater. I knew where the fighting ring was. I'd heard about it in the service, a network of ex-military, ex-cops, men who trained dogs to kill each other for money. I'd helped shut down 2 operations overseas. I knew the signs, the locations, the people. I found him in a raid 3 weeks later. The puppy, now 3 years old, scarred, half-blind in one eye, his right ear torn to a stump, was in a cage with 6 others, waiting for a match that would likely kill him. He was the only shepherd. The rest were pits, bred for this, born to it. He was an outsider. A survivor. A dog who'd learned that the world was pain, and the only way through was to endure. I paid his fine, the legal fiction that made his rescue a purchase rather than evidence, and I took him to a property I'd bought with my discharge money. 40 acres, remote, with a cabin and a training yard and woods that went on forever. I named him Shadow, because he followed me everywhere. Because he was dark, damaged, hard to see in low light. Because he was the shape of everything my father had tried to destroy. I didn't train him to kill. That was important. That was the difference between my father and me. He'd used violence to create obedience. I used patience to create trust. Shadow had been hurt, not just physically, though the scars were extensive, but mentally. He flinched at raised voices. He cowered at the sound of metal on metal. He wouldn't eat from a bowl that wasn't his, wouldn't sleep in a bed that moved, wouldn't let me touch his head until we'd known each other for 3 months. I rebuilt him, not into a weapon, into a partner. I taught him to track my scent first, then others. I taught him to hold, to wait, to release on command. I taught him that my hand meant safety, that my voice meant direction, that my presence meant he was not alone. And I taught him my father's scent. I collected it carefully. A shirt from the laundry, a boot from the closet, the pillowcase from his bed. I sealed them in jars, let Shadow smell them, rewarded him when he found them hidden, when he tracked them across the property, when he sat and waited and watched without attacking. My father didn't know about Shadow. He thought I'd bought a companion dog, a therapy animal, something soft for a damaged veteran. He laughed when I mentioned it. Dogs are tools, he said. You should know that. You trained enough of them. Shadow's not a tool, I said. He's a witness. My father didn't understand. He didn't need to. I moved back into the house. I played the dutiful daughter, cooking, cleaning, listening to his stories, smiling at his jokes. And every night I took Shadow into the woods. We ran, we tracked. We practiced the commands that would matter when the time came. And I fed my father's paranoia. It started small. A bone on the porch, deer, not dog, but my father didn't know the difference. He found it in the morning, white and gleaming, and he frowned. Coyotes, he said. Maybe, I said, then fur, not shadows. I bought rabbit pelts from a trapper left on the kitchen floor, the living room rug, my father's bed. He started locking doors, checking windows, drinking more, then tracks. Mud prints, the right size, the right shape, appearing in the driveway, on the deck, circling the house. I made them with a cast I'd taken of Shadow's paw, pressed into wet earth, left to dry. My father installed cameras, I disabled them. He called the police, I greeted them, explained his confusion, his medication, his episodes, they left. He raged, I soothed. He started seeing Shadow. Not close, I kept him at a distance, but at the edge of the woods, in the twilight, a shape that moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped. A pair of eyes that reflected the porch light. A shape that was too big for a coyote, too silent for a deer, too patient for anything natural. "It's Duke," my father muttered one night, drunk, staring out the kitchen window. "He's back. The bitch sent him back." "Who's back?" I asked, innocent. "Duke, the dog, the one who." He stopped, looked at me. His eyes were wet, roomy, the eyes of an old man seeing ghosts. "You don't remember. You were too young." "I remember everything," I said. He didn't hear me. He was looking past me into the dark, where Shadow sat invisible, watching, waiting. The nightmare started. My father woke screaming, shouting names, not enemies from the war, but names I recognized. Scout, Buddy, Lady, Duke, the dogs he'd killed, the women he'd broken, the lives he'd ended. He'd wake drenched in sweat, reach for his pistol, find me standing in the doorway with a glass of water. "Bad dream?" I'd ask. "Go to bed," he'd snap. But his hand shook, and he never went back to sleep. I replaced his sleeping pills with placebos. I let him drink, encouraged it, even bringing home bottles, pouring his drinks, watching him sink deeper into the fog where the ghosts lived. I wanted him awake enough to see, drunk enough to doubt, tired enough to break. It took 8 months. 8 months of running with Shadow in the woods, of planting evidence, of feeding paranoia, of being the perfect daughter while I dismantled my father's mind piece by piece. And then, the night before the anniversary of Duke's death, March 14th, I found the confession. It wasn't planned. My father, in a drunken stupor, had fallen in the kitchen. He'd hit his head on the counter, not hard enough to injure but hard enough to disorient. I helped him to bed. I sat with him while he drifted, muttering into the space between sleep and waking. And then he started talking. Not to me, to them, to the dogs, to my mother, to the ghosts he'd spent his life creating. "Duke," he whispered, "I'm sorry, I had to. She was turning on me, the dog was turning her." I pulled out my phone. I started recording, and Lorraine, he continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. The insulin, I just wanted her to sleep, to stop talking, to stop planning. She was going to leave me, she was going to take the diaries." "The diaries, Lorraine, why did you write them? Why did you have to remember?" he sobbed. A sound I'd never heard from him. Wet, broken, childish. "The puppy," he said, "the one in the shed. I sold him to Vargas, the fighter. I knew what he'd do. I wanted to. I wanted you to know that I could take everything, even hope, even that." He opened his eyes. He looked at me, but he didn't see me. He saw my mother. He saw Duke. He saw the accumulation of every cruelty he'd ever committed, standing in the doorway with a phone in its hand. "I'm sorry," he said to me, to them, to the air. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I didn't accept his apology. I didn't speak. I just recorded and waited and watched him sink back into sleep with tears on his face that were too late, too small, too meaningless. I had what I needed. The confession, the names, the proof, but I didn't call the police, not yet. The next night, March 14th, the anniversary, I made dinner. Steak, his favorite, potatoes, wine. I let him drink, encouraged him, poured his glass full every time it emptied. I wore a dress the color of blood. I smiled. I listened to his stories, his memories, his justifications. After dinner, he went to the porch for a cigarette. I followed. The night was cold, clear, the stars sharp as broken glass. The woods were dark, silent, waiting. He lit his cigarette. He looked at the tree line, and he froze. Shadow was there, not hidden, not distant. 10 feet away, sitting in the grass, visible in the porch light. His scarred face, his clouded eye, his torn ear, watching. My father dropped the cigarette. "Duke," he whispered, "no, no, you're dead. I killed you." He turned to run, stumbled, fell against the railing. I didn't move, I just watched. Shadow didn't move either. He sat. He waited. He was trained to do that, to hold, to watch, to be present without attacking until the command came. But I didn't give the command. I never would. My father scrambled to his feet. He ran inside. He grabbed his pistol from the nightstand. He came back to the porch, waving it, screaming at the dark, at Shadow, at the ghosts that weren't there. "Come on," he shouted. "Come on, you bastard. You want me? Come get me." Shadow didn't move. He just sat and watched, and waited. My father fired. The shot went wild into the trees. He fired again, and again. Emptying the magazine at a dog that was no longer there, Shadow had vanished at the first shot, melted into the dark, his training holding. The neighbors called the police. I called them too, from the kitchen, my voice trembling, the perfect frightened daughter. "My father," I said, "he's having an episode. He's armed. Please hurry." They came with sirens. They found my father on the porch, pistol in hand, screaming at the woods, urine running down his leg, his face purple, his eyes wild. They disarmed him, they cuffed him. They read him his rights while he babbled about dogs, about ghosts, about confessions he'd made to a daughter who didn't exist. I gave them my phone. The recording, the diaries, the location of the graves in the woods marked with brass plaques. The name of the fighting ring operator, Vargas, who confirmed the sale of the puppy. The death certificate of my mother, the insulin records, the 7 to 2 hours in the basement. My father was arrested, not for killing Duke. The statute of limitations on animal cruelty had passed. Not for my mother's death, natural causes, the original coroner had ruled, and proving otherwise would take years. But for the confessed fraud, the stolen military plaques, the unregistered weapon, the threats to neighbors. Enough to hold him, enough to start. He was evaluated by a court psychiatrist. Diagnosed with PTSD, dementia, paranoid psychosis, sent to a VA psychiatric facility rather than prison. I didn't attend the hearing. I didn't need to see him in restraints in a hospital gown in the kind of locked room he'd built for my mother, but I visited once. 3 months after his commitment, he was smaller than I'd ever seen him. The uniform was gone, the medals were gone. He was just an old man in a wheelchair, oxygen tube in his nose, staring at a wall. I sat across from him. I didn't speak. I just opened my hand, and Shadow, who I'd brought, who was allowed as my therapy animal, who sat at my side like a shadow made flesh, pressed his head into my palm. My father saw him. His eyes widened, his mouth opened. No sound came out. "This is Shadow," I said. "You sold him to die. He lived, he learned. He chose to stay with me." I stood up. I walked to the door. Shadow followed, his gait steady, his scarred face calm. "He doesn't need to attack you," I said, my hand on the doorframe. "He just needs to exist, to be here, to be alive when you're not." I left. I didn't look back. I heard my father screaming as the orderlies restrained him, screaming about dogs, about ghosts, about the daughter who'd brought the past into his present and made it sit and wait and watch. I didn't keep the house. I sold it to a developer who demolished it, built apartments, planted a garden where the picnic table had been. I didn't visit the grave markers in the woods. I had them exhumed, the dog's remains cremated, the ashes scattered in a meadow where I'd run with Shadow, where grass grew thick and no one had ever bled. I bought land. 40 acres became 80. The cabin became a complex, kennels, training yards, medical facilities, a staff of veterans who understood trauma, who knew what it meant to rebuild a creature that the world had broken. I called it Duke's Run. Not a shelter. A sanctuary for dogs rescued from fighting rings, from abusive homes, from military units that had used them and discarded them. We didn't train obedience, we trained trust. We didn't breed soldiers, we healed witnesses. The logo was a paw print with a scar. The motto, we don't train obedience, we train trust. Shadow was the first resident. He became the teacher, the dog who showed newcomers that humans could be different, that hands could mean gentleness. That presence didn't require pain. He lived 6 more years. When he died, I buried him in the meadow, in ground that was soft, in a grave that was deep, with my hands that didn't bleed because no one hit me for crying. I still run with the dogs. Every dawn, through the woods, through the meadow, through the place where Shadow is buried. And every time a new dog, scarred, frightened, expecting the worst, looks back to check that I'm still there, that I haven't abandoned them, that they are not alone, I smile. Because the dog my father sold to teach obedience learned something better. He learned that loyalty is not demanded, it is given. That trust is not beaten into flesh. It is built, day by day, choice by choice, until the creature that was broken becomes the creature that heals others. And my father in his hospital room still screams at shadows. Still sees dogs in the corners, still waits for an attack that will never come, because the worst thing I could do to him was not violence. It was patience. It was presence. It was the simple, terrible fact of a dog who lived when he wanted him dead, who chose to stay when he wanted him gone, who sits in my memory forever, watching, waiting, and never attacking.